It might be questioned why a course on classical humanities education begins with a text that doesn't belong to the Western tradition, which is usually thought to begin with the ancient Greeks. It's argued that for whatever achievements the Mesopotamians made, they don't ultimately belong to this tradition any more than do ancient China or India. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a useful example that illustrates the errors of this way of thinking. Cultures are not hermetically sealed boxes. Instead, they're fluid, constantly changing as they learn and borrow from one another. Due to this, it's a mistake to think of cultural traditions as clear-cut or homogeneous entities. In the end, these are artificial constructs that we make for ourselves for some exigent purpose, such as teaching or bibliographical referencing. But they don't really reflect in any one-to-one manner an external reality, which is far too complex to be captured by a single heading. Moreover, even if there were no de facto demonstrable link between the two cultures, they might still have certain elements in common that would make sense to explore in a comparative manner. And finally, there's been an ongoing debate about whether there is something that can be uniquely identified as the Western tradition. And the results of this have shown the problems involved in trying to define this with any precision. Given this, it's difficult to say exactly what this includes and what it does not. In any case, while it's true that the Epic of Gilgamesh does not belong to the traditional Western canon, it nonetheless shares a number of profound elements with the Old Testament, and it seems clear that the Old Testament was influenced by it. Parallels have also been drawn between certain motifs in Gilgamesh and the story of the Garden of Eden. As we've noted in chapter 5 of Gilgamesh, there are features of the story of the flood which bear obvious similarities to that described in Genesis 6-8. Forerunners of some of the elements of Ecclesiastes can also be found there. Moreover, the story also contains certain aspects which seem to anticipate Greek culture and religion. Scholars have often found parallels to the Greek gods and goddesses in the Mesopotamian pantheon. In addition, many of the religious practices depicted in the work, such as making burnt offerings and other forms of sacrifice, also resemble practices depicted in both the Old Testament and ancient Greek texts such as Homer. Gilgamesh himself has been compared to the Greek heroes Odysseus and Hercules, and many other parallels with Greek mythology have been pointed out. Based on these similarities, it's been speculated that there might have been some contact between the Greek bards and the Assyrian scribes. The well-known Assyriologist Samuel Noah Kramer argued that one can find the beginning of most all forms of culture in ancient Sumer, which contains, so to speak, the first Moses, the first Job, the first cosmology, the first history, etc. He was thus keen to draw numerous parallels to the Old Testament and Greek culture. In a sense, there's something a bit childish in trying for ideological reasons to prove that one culture was earlier than another, with the implication being that the former is ipso facto more valuable and the latter only derivative. This is a strategy that has long been employed in order to put up on a pedestal the culture of the ancient Greeks, Hebrews, Egyptians, or others. The importance and value of a culture is not determined by its antiquity, and indeed the very notion of a culture having relative importance and value vis-a-vis others has long since been discarded in the social sciences anyway. The point is rather that when we observe that there are cultures which have similar stories, then we can use this as a way to understand the nature of these different cultures. Each culture is telling the story in its own way, in its own cultural and historical context. So by comparing and contrasting the way in which the same story is told in different cultures, we have a valuable methodological tool by which to gain insight into both cultures. So there's every reason to begin with the Epic of Gilgamesh and to think that early texts from other cultures might very well offer useful parallels. The Western tradition, for whatever that might be, is enriched and not diminished by these kinds of connections.